inviting somebody to relationship and demanding. The obligation of relationship, like demand, causes us to want to pull away from people, right? Like we don't like to be controlled. And on the other hand, if we invite somebody like in vulnerability and tenderness and kindness, there is this like, oh, I'm wanted. It inspires us to do great things, right? When we are invited to goodness, but when it's demanded of us, it feels like slavery. We are going to push that away as much as we can.
We're saved by the word, but we're healed by his people.
And it was through them that I came to realize that I wasn't unlovable and that I wasn't unworthy, or at least not any more unlovable or unworthy than any of us are.
People can relate whatever pain or trauma they're into is to this crumbling or this pile of ashes, but it can be resurrected into something beautiful.
Wisdom is always hard earned.
Ready? Ready to rock and roll? Is that action? All right.
Okay. That's right.
All right.
Absolutely. Go. 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 Go.
Hello, everybody. It's Jason Will with
Go. Go. Go.
This is a real estate podcast, but we talk about leadership, personal growth, and becoming the best version of yourself. Leadership, check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Growth, best version of yourself.
Go. Go.
So this is a real estate podcast. All right. Lindsey Futo.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Impact Agent Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you had to get like a babysitter to be here.
Yeah.
I mean, like you went to great expense and trouble. I mean, we should let the audience know that you have, a tribe of children.
Yeah,
so
that's right. That's right. And I was actually talking to my mother about that this morning because she was like, hey, do you want me to go over to your house and hang out with your kids? She's been out of town. She just got back yesterday. I was like, oh no. I was like, I have a babysitter this morning. And she's like, are you sure? Are you sure that's a good idea?
Right.
But I've been pretty blessed to find some babysitters who are good at wrangling.
Yeah, it's a small army. How many kids do you have total?
5.
5 kids.
That's right.
So there's 7 of you.
Yep.
All together. So yeah, that's quite the tribe.
Yeah.
So this is the title of my podcast is the Impact Agent Podcast. And so it started out as just a real estate podcast.
Yeah.
And it still has we do still do real estate shows, but it's really kind of morphed into people that are impact agents, not just real estate agents, but just impact agents in general on the world. And I have heard that you have an amazing testimony. I was actually absent the day at church when they did a little video expose on you. And people still talk to this day about how amazing that was and how it impacted them. So I've been thinking about doing this with you for a while. So Thanks for coming in.
Well, thanks for letting me be here. I'm excited to be here. And then there's also this, it's not so much nervousness for me because I've shared my story actually a lot over like the last 15 years now, because that was where the turning point came for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we all kind of, hopefully, if we're lucky enough to have the right people in our lives that say like it's okay to be aware of your story and it's okay to tell your story, then we get to a place where we can start sharing that. But I've never shared it in this way before, like on airwaves.
Yeah, I mean, there's no telling who might hear this,
right,
and what country they might be in. Do you formally counsel anybody, or do people reach out to you if they're struggling?
Well, actually, it's kind of funny because so I had some trauma in my childhood, which I'm sure we're going to discuss.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that.
But I remember my mom, when she first found out about it, she would beg me to go to counseling. And it's probably not surprising because I think this is true for a lot of people that I had attached a stigma to counseling. And so I would say things to her like, I don't need counseling. I'm not crazy, and be real like defensive. Get off my back. There's nothing wrong with me. I think I felt like she was trying to fix me. She was trying to love me, you know. And interestingly enough, as my life became more and more impacted by the fact that I hadn't dealt with this trauma, I eventually did wind up going to counseling because at that point it was like, well, now my life really is a mess because I didn't get counseling when I probably should have, you know? So, in that experience, I learned that that is what I love. That's actually what I love more than anything. And I didn't find that out until after I had already graduated from college. So, I hope eventually to go to grad school and get a counseling degree. And who knows when I'll do that with my tribe of children to care for. But so I don't formally provide counseling to anybody, but it is really cool how as you share your story and people become more familiar with the things that you have walked through, the Bible tells us that we overcome the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. And so knowing our story and sharing our story is really important. Like it's part of God's strategy to make the world right again, I think. And so people will seek me out if they have heard from somebody else that I have a story and they kind of identify with one piece or another or a lot of the pieces, and say, hey, can I talk to you about that? And it's kind of neat because I'm not a professional counselor, but it's really neat to be able to share the ways that God has brought comfort to me in my life and offer that to other people so that they can be comforted by that too. And that's a biblical concept in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. It talks about that God allows suffering to overflow into our life, like the suffering of Christ, because he's going to comfort us in the same way that he comforted Jesus on the cross and like made it possible for him to go through the worst possible thing. And then as we receive that comfort, we will be able to comfort others. So I think it's really important for us to be able to use our story for God's glory. And it's very fulfilling. We find fulfillment in that. Like we would be shocked that the hardest things in our lives somehow, when redeemed by God, become the most fulfilling things in our life. It's like the way into the most fulfilling things in our lives, I think.
Well, I think that's an interesting point that you make for people that are dealing with something. So many people, I think, just, bottle it up, bury it. They don't share it. There's a lot of shame around it. Yeah. They're not using it. And so you're basically saying to share it, to pull back the curtain of whatever you're dealing with, that, there's a great deal of power in there and healing, and not just for yourself, but for other people. Right. So I think that's a big distinction that people should hear, because I want this podcast, just again, not to be too repetitive, but I want this podcast to impact people. Yeah. And that's a huge piece of this. So tell us a little bit about your story. What age did you become a victim? Is that a word you care to use? So I think it's a right word. I think that we can kind of almost obsessively, which is, by the way, I think what put me on a bad trajectory for a while, think of ourselves as a victim. We hear people talk about the victim mentality, or you're such a martyr, that kind of thing. Right? So I think we have to be cautious with that, but also not to the opposite end, that we pretend like nothing bad has ever happened to us and just grit our teeth and power through. And as you were talking a minute ago and talking about how people kind of bottle things up, that was what I was kind of thinking in my mind. Like we have this tendency, or at least I know I did. I thought like, I'm just going to power through this hard thing that has happened to me so that I can get on with my life. And I don't believe that God creates evil. I don't believe that he causes evil, but I believe we live in a world where sin has given way to every kind of evil. In fact, actually, you think about it, like if God told us not to sin, he was trying to prevent evil, right? Mm-hmm. But it's humanity, really. Like we are the ones who let evil into this world that God entrusted to us in the Garden of Eden. And so in that way, we really have no one to blame but ourselves. But I think that we take a step back and we look at these circumstances. God is sovereign over the evil that takes place in our lives. Like it's hard for us to understand like that God allows, doesn't cause, doesn't create, but allows evil. It's as a result of the fact that he's given us all free will.
just like God doesn't force me to choose him, God doesn't force a rapist not to rape somebody. Like, that is part of their free will and their choice to rebel against God. But it's not God's will that they would sin, right, against me or anyone else for that matter. And so I think that being able to acknowledge that sometimes God uses the things that evil has perpetrated against us to point us in a direction of calling on our lives, that we find our purpose in that. There is a man by the name of Dan Allender. He is a phenomenal Christian counselor, and he's so educated that, like, I stand in utter awe, like, as he speaks. But he talks about that God uses the hard things in our lives, the things that we would normally, like, shy away from, try to run away from, to actually bring out our calling. And so I think that it's that place where I'm willing to say, like, I am the adult victim of childhood sexual abuse, and own that, but not in such a way that I would wallow in it and use it as an excuse to never rise above that circumstance, but in a sense of honor for the story that God is writing in my life and the calling that he has placed on my life, and that he revealed that to me through that experience, so that now that thing is not the thing that's holding me back. It's the thing that's propelling me forward.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I think what I'm hearing is that, all right, so to accept the fact that you're a victim, there's a difference between being a victim and recognize the fact you've been a victim of abuse, and then having a victim mentality.
Yeah. I think that one is about an event that happened, and one is about identity.
Yeah, and recognizing that if you're a victim, it wasn't your fault.
That's right.
So releasing any ownership of the act, or repetitive evil.
Like, it wasn't because I wasn't victimized because there's something wrong with me. Yeah.
And then just using this for the power of good.
Yeah.
You don't want to, take ownership of this in a way that, like you said, makes you become a person who is just seeking to be numb, or seeking to not have responsibility, or seeking not to, be a grown up because this thing happened to you and it wasn't your fault and it ruined everything. So that's important to, I think, the audience to hear as well, because I think there's a lot of people that use this, whatever type of abuse or circumstance, to just kind of give up.
Yeah.
And say, because life is hard.
Yeah.
To deal with it and move forward and honor it, like you say. I think that's an important point, to honor it. You can use this to honor your life, honor other people's lives. So to just be that, to have that victim mentality, you're dishonoring.
That's right. Yeah.
Your life and your calling, as you mentioned. So there's a lot of powerful points in there. So what age did this happen in your life, this sexual abuse?
Well, unfortunately, it didn't happen at a single age. And when people realize that this is part of your story, they come and they tell you their story. And I will tell you right now that my story is child's play compared to a lot of the stories that I've heard, which is absolutely heartbreaking to me. So many people will say, like, from the age of this to this was going on, like, continuously with this same person. Nobody knew. They groomed me for it. They set me up for it. And then they shamed me into hiding it. And for me, that wasn't my experience, but that is the very common experience, because, like, an enormous percentage of sexual abuse victims are victimized by people they know.
Yeah.
It's not some creepy man hiding in a dark alley waiting to attack you. It's somebody who has some bents that are hidden, but on the surface they look very normal, and that's what gives them opportunity, really. Far more opportunity than the creepy man hiding in the alley would have. So for me, when I was 3, someone who was a much older child of a family friend isolated me in a bathroom and touched me inappropriately. That would be like the politically correct and more comfortable way of saying what happened, right? Like that's how we usually say things like that. But then when I was 15, I was date raped. And from that time that I was like 3 to 15, I was very involved in church, and I was literally like there every time the doors were open, you know, and knew all the Sunday school answers, and I was making straight A's and involved in sports and choir and like, I mean, just kind of, you know, an all-American kid. And then at the age of 15, after that happened to me, I think that all those right Christian answers that I knew up here, it began to become very evident that I knew them up here in my head, but that it wasn't very real in my heart. Like that I would say, you know, that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose out of rote. But deep down, I think I thought, how can you cause this to work together for good for me?
Right.
And I really doubted that. I love the story of Joseph in the Old Testament because his brothers like beat him and leave him for dead, but then they realize like, oh my gosh, you know, we're going to get in trouble for this. Like they're not concerned with whether it was right or wrong, just whether they're going to get in trouble for it. So they sell him into slavery, right? And then years later, he becomes like the second most powerful man in Egypt, where he had been enslaved and all kinds of other terrible things had happened to him in the process. And then his brothers come up to visit Egypt because there's a famine and they need food. And he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him because probably was dressed up like a pharaoh, I'm guessing.
Right.
You know, he don't quite look the same way anymore. And it's so interesting because as the story unfolds, eventually, like, he entraps them, but not with intentions to harm them, intentions to bring the whole family back to him so that he can be reunited with them and forgive them. And he says to them, don't fear me, because what you intended for evil against me, God has used for good. And so I had heard that story growing up, but at the age of 15, it was like, how can you use this evil for good? I don't get it, you know? And so there was a lot of doubt. And look, God can handle our doubt. Like he is big enough to carry the weight of our doubt. I think that, you know, in the New Testament, when someone came to Jesus looking for a miracle, and Jesus said, well, anything's possible for him who believes. And the man said, well, I do believe, but help me with my unbelief. That honors God, that we would be honest, that we're struggling to believe, but that we want to believe, because God already knows our hearts. Like he knows if we're struggling with unbelief. But I think at that season of my life, at the age of 15, I was too proud to admit that I didn't believe. And so I wanted to like keep that hidden to all my church friends. Cause you know, we get around church people, we church people get around other church people. And it's almost like we kind of can work ourselves into like this big facade, right? Of like who can look more spiritual. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, nobody has a heaven or hell to put me in but God. And when I care more about what the people around me think than what my creator and my father and my savior think of me, what I am pretty clearly demonstrating is that he's not my God. They are. Like I am living for their approval, not his, right? And so over the course of many years, from the age of 15 to the age of 22, the end of 22, I was about to turn 23 when everything kind of began to change for me. I had this great undoing of all of my religiosity, of all of my pretense, of all of my knowing the right answers up here without really believing them in my heart. And so I entered into a really long, dark season of running the opposite direction from God in my heart and in my private life, while trying to pretend to a lot of my religious friends like I still had it pretty together. And then at the very end of that, and this was like the crescendo that led to the breakthrough for me. But at the very end of it, I actually was gang raped by two men who saw me in a bar, and I don't remember most of that night. I blacked out. And when I woke up, I was like, where am I? How did I get here? And it was terrible, as I'm sure you might imagine. And yet that situation produced a desperation in me, I think. And I couldn't have reached out for God apart from the grace that God gave me to reach out for him. We don't just by self-will decide we're going to gravitate toward God. Even the desire for God comes from God as a gift to us of his grace, But I think it was an eye-opening, that's so mild. It was a jolting experience. And I realized that the running from God was only putting me more in harm's way, and that it was time to come home.
Well, let's recap this because this is a lot. Yeah. So at 15, did you have a conversation with your parents about what happened around that age?
Not at that age.
Okay, so just so we're clear, you just you suppressed this.
Yeah.
And whatever it was, it just got buried.
Yeah.
But there was this underlying conflict that was going on internally, I think, because you had this strong faith on the outside, but maybe it wasn't whole on the inside. And so at age 22, about to turn 23, you just kind of called yourself on your own BS, or what happened?
No, I wish that any of us could say something that great, but we can't. It usually doesn't happen that way. It really was we come to the end of ourselves, and it's not a matter of strength, because our strength is gone at that point. We're at the end of our rope and God is near to the brokenhearted. So the best way I know how to put it is in Psalm 139, David is writing about, we use this a lot as a pro-life scripture, right? You formed me, you know me, you formed me in my mother's womb. Toward the end of that chapter, he says, surely if I made my bed in the depths of hell, you would find me there. And I don't know any description for the hell of my own making better than that one. I made my bed in the depths of hell, and he came after me. And I think that realizing that I was as good as dead, as good as gone, worthless to anyone who would have had any sense. But I still had worth to him.
Did you abuse alcohol from 15 to 22? Was this a gradual thing where you started reaching out to substances to kind of escape?
Yeah. I really kind of continued to play the part of the good girl for several years. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I was almost halfway through college that I really started kind of traveling down this road of substance abuse. I definitely, wanted to be numb. I didn't want to be constantly aware. It was almost like, a nagging voice in the back of my mind all the time telling me, that I was different, from the other girls that I hung out with or just in general, the people that I hung out with, that obviously there was something wrong with me or this wouldn't have happened to me. And I think that the more that I got into substance abuse, the more I did things that I regretted. And so there was more to numb. And so it's like this vicious cycle, right? So I think that over time, it was only going to circle the toilet bowl. You know?
Well, I wonder even how different you might have been from other people. Because it just seems like, especially if you think about college, there's so much alcohol abuse. Even I myself have been involved in situations where it's hard for us to decipher, is this
abuse or is it not?
Yeah. Is this a willing participant or is it not? There was so much of that.
Yeah.
I look back on it now sometimes and go, God, thinking about my own role in some of these things, even just the pressure that guys or that I put on girls.
Yeah. And there's so much honor in you even saying that, because I think that there are so many men who are they're afraid that they might be like labeled something that they really know in their hearts. Like, that's not my heart toward women. But at the time that I was involved in this situation or that situation, I was just kind of being the guy and going along. And I think that substance abuse creates this very, unclear situation for everyone involved, right? It happens so much. I wasn't different from most people, really. So they say that 1 in 4 women in my generation will be in some way, like, inappropriately sexualized by the time she's 18. 1 in 3 in my daughter's generation will be, and 1 in 6 males are in my generation and in my children's generation. And so this is far more common, than we realize. And so I was so convinced that I was different from everybody. And the truth is that if there had been, if we had had a room full of 20 women, that 5 of them, I would have been 1 in 5 who had similar stories.
It's scary now, being a parent of a daughter
yeah.
and thinking, good grief.
Right.
And then I watch.
Feeling very powerless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I watch a lot of Dateline. And, there's a ton of stories on there where this woman had too much to drink, and then the males in her life who she thought were going to protect her saw opportunity, and it's very, very sad. Yeah. But so the alcohol, you started, that evolved into harder things.
Alcohol is something that is so socially acceptable, most circles, and I will say I am a Christian. And I am not a Christian who believes that all alcohol consumption is wrong. And there are Christians who believe that. And it's like they hang their entire religion on that. And that's sad to me. Mm-hmm. My pastor a couple of years ago was addressing this situation, and he is a non-drinker for sure. But he said, I'm not going to make up and say something that the Bible doesn't say just because I'm not a drinker and think that you shouldn't. Because the Bible doesn't say that you cannot drink alcohol and be a Christian. It tells you shouldn't be drunk. And I think that for a lot of people, that's where it gets a little fuzzy, because then it's like, well, how do I say if I'm, drinking too much or not? And for me, it's funny. God has, in the last few years, really spoken to me about this, because I a lot of times find myself kind of caught between like people who they drink with no conscience, against it, and people who have such a strong conscience against it that they can really be very judgmental and without meaning to be unbiblical about it. It's like they think the end justifies the means, They're actually being pretty unbiblical about it. For me, as someone with a history of substance abuse, I was kind of having a conversation with God about this one day. And the thing that I really felt like he placed on my heart was that so oftentimes, like, let's just say that we come to the end of a long, hard day, and it's like, I just need to unwind a little bit. Yeah. I think that scripture that I talked about earlier from 2 Corinthians 1 about how suffering overflows into our life so that God can comfort us, and then we're supposed to comfort others. What happens is we run to alcohol instead of running to God for comfort, and then we numb ourselves to the discomfort. But if we numb ourselves to the discomfort we're experiencing, we're also numbing ourselves to God's comfort. Like we're missing out on something. And it's something that has a far greater worth than that temporary relief that the alcohol sometimes brings, right?
Yeah.
So for me, alcohol was something that I ran to excessively. I had in college some kidney infections and was given pain medication for them because they were, oh my gosh, excruciatingly painful, right? But eventually it just got to where I didn't have a conscience against substance abuse. Whereas as a younger age, like I was very judgmental toward people, well, who were underage drinkers anyways, not people who were of age who would have a glass of wine or a beer sometimes. I wasn't that far, into that type of legalism. And, what happens is as we start compromising, it becomes so much easier to compromise further and further and further.
You're obviously, people listening to this podcast are going to hear somebody who's very intellectual, and you're probably an overthinker and just constantly analyzing things and thinking about things. And so I think you might have already mentioned it, like the substances are just a way to kind of quiet those voices so that you can just kind of almost be in a state where you can kind of relax. So to kind of recap this also, the substances put you in a state of weakness to where you could be further victimized. Yeah. You wanted to numb your awareness, but when you numb your awareness not only to the past, but to what's the present. Yes. Like people who are engaging you in inappropriate ways or have, we have this natural sixth sense, this fear instinct, and it numbs that. So you wake up in a strange place, something bad has happened. You're like, I've got to fix this. That's the catalyst for change. Who do you seek for help? Do you go to your parents then and go, hey, listen?
Yeah, no, I still didn't tell them what had happened. But at that point, they could tell that, like, I definitely had a substance abuse problem. And they were very worried. Like, my mom recounts a time that she actually told me maybe I needed to go to rehab. And I was not in my right mind at the time, but I told her that she would sooner find me swinging from the rafters than she would find me in a rehabilitation facility. I mean, can you imagine as a parent if your child said that to you?
I'm sure that freaked her out.
Oh,
is that, are you thinking about that?
So then she said that she became very fearful, like, will she take her own life, or will she, in some inebriated state, take somebody else's life accidentally? I think she was probably mainly concerned about like car accidents or something like that. So I didn't, it had to have been my pride, because they were kind of hammering at me like, can we get you help? They were so sweet. Like, they were so kind in the way that they were trying to help me. But, I think I wind up, you asked me earlier, do people come to me for counseling? A lot of parents come talk to me. I've got a kid who's kind of dabbling in this or that, or they've gone off the deep end, or, just they're not walking with the Lord right now, and this is a very common conversation that I have. And, I think it's really important for parents to realize that this is not an equation that you can manipulate to get the answer that you want. Your child is not your problem to solve. They are your baby to love. And your greatest act of love is doing the very best that you can do. Not in a superficial way, but like for real, the best you can do. Sometimes it's tough love. No, you can't have money from me because I know you're going to go use it for things that could be harmful for you. Sometimes it's mercy. It's you don't have a place to go, but you'll always have a place here. But ultimately knowing that doing all the right combination of things is not going to like manipulate your child into coming back home or doing the right thing. It is always an act of God when a person repents, and being willing to release your child to God. And like, I pray that none of my children struggle with addiction, because it's terrible. And yet I also know that it's so prevalent, and I have 5 kids, that 1 or 2 or more might. And so I know that I may have to practice what I'm preaching here in the future. And here's the thing, even if it's not addiction, there will be some other way. We as parents all have to practice this, regardless of what our kids' issues are. Releasing our child to God, like hitting our knees for them and, laboring over them in tears and in prayer, and being willing to own it to them when we blow it. I shouldn't have given you that money.
Right.
Or I should have let you come home. I shouldn't have sent you away. I think that it's a really emotional and turbulent scenario for families. So my parents did, I believe, like in hindsight, like a phenomenal job of navigating it, but they still weren't perfect. So when I eventually came home to them, I did not tell them what had happened, but I had a friend who had invited me. It's so funny. So she was my roommate my freshman year of college. And that was the season of my life where I was still looking really spiritual on the outside, though I was rebelling on the inside. And so she is, I was going to say was, she's still alive and she still is a strong Christian. She was a very strong Christian and still is. And she was part of a ministry at the University of Georgia, and she had just kind of randomly invited me to come over and go to a Wednesday night thing with her. And I remember when I got there, I was not sober at all. And I can remember walking in and trying to find a seat. And in that season of my life, and a lot of people are like, what do you mean God spoke to you or you heard God's voice? That seems a little weird. That seems a little spooky. I think it's neat that the Bible describes God's voice as a still small voice a lot of the time, because I think that is most commonly what it is for me. It's like this wisdom that comes from within, except for I am absolutely positive that I'm not that wise. So it must have been the voice of God.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, like that's the only way that I know, because it couldn't have been me. But I can remember getting there and not being sober at all, and even using on the way there. And God telling me that if I would flush what I had with me down the toilet, that he would set me free. And what's so funny was I was in the bathroom and I could have, and I didn't, because I was like, yeah, right. Because I had been, trying to get sober and trying to get sober and trying to get sober and trying to get sober for a while, because I knew that my life was out of control.
Is this just for timeline purposes? Is this after the rape? Like
yes.
Your rock
yes.
bottom moment?
Yes. Like immediately after.
Okay.
Yeah. Like within just, I'm trying to think about the exact date. This was 3 days after.
So you were met with conviction on that morning that you woke up, but you were still using in the days.
Yeah, because at that point, like I was literally dependent. Like I didn't know how to live without it.
Yeah.
I was that I was that addicted. And so I can remember trying to come out of the bathroom and find a seat, but this ministry is just it's so incredible. I love this minister. I didn't go to the University of Georgia. I went to Georgia Tech. And it's so humorous to me that like the most life-altering spiritual moment that I've probably ever had happened at the college that is my college's rival,
Right.
And so I come out of the bathroom and I'm looking for her, and the halls are just packed. I mean, like people are in there like sardines, and I can't find her anywhere. And I'm literally entertaining the thought of leaving, because I'm thinking like, I'm not even in my right mind right now. Can't be around people right now. And just on a whim, I go back into the bathroom and I flush what I had brought with me down the toilet. And I walk back out the bathroom, and it's kind of like that moment where all the lights come on and the angels are singing, like, oh, and the whole aisles have cleared out. Everybody's in their seat, and she's sitting there waving at me. She's got a seat saved for me. And so I knew, like, that was the moment when I knew that something big was about to happen. Wow. But I don't think I ever could have anticipated how it just goes to show how much God loves me. Like that could sound like a bragging thing, but I think we should love that God delights in us that much, that like we aren't just a number in a crowd. Like it's very personal, and he is that way toward all of us. Like that's not just for me, that's for you, and that's for all of my children. And so that night, the pastor preached on 2 Corinthians 5:17. If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. And what's so kind of funny to me is that I had grown up knowing that scripture. And yet I didn't think I was that bad. because I asked Jesus into my heart when I was 3, you
Right.
know, right? And that season of wandering away from God revealed to me my own depravity. And God, in his mercy, wanted me to know how much I needed to be made new. Because I don't think I ever would have seen that if I had continued to suppress that depravity and like pretend I had it all together. But it was still living on the inside, you know, because what's inside comes out when we get squeezed, you know? So that night, he was so funny. He said, we had a prayer meeting before this. And he said, one of our interns said that they had this vision that there's somebody here tonight who has been in bondage and they have been asking God to set them free. And he wants you to know, whoever you are, that he has already taken the shackles off. You just need to drop the chains because you're holding on to them. And it was like, this is a very like big college ministry, like, I don't know, at least 1,000 in the room, I think. But to me, like, it was like Jesus had just blown open those doors and walked right over to me and picked me out of a crowd and touched me. And I laugh because my husband is like Mr. like never touched alcohol, never smoked anything, you know, and we have had conversations where he has said, not a lot, but a few, you don't know how lucky you are, like, that you had that experience, because Jesus, you know Jesus in ways that I can't, right? I think about the story of the woman who came and washed Jesus' feet, you know, with her tears in her hair and broke this alabaster box, which was like a year's wages, right, over his feet. And the Pharisees, these were like the very religious people, like who always did everything right and got everything right. But they wanted to trap people, you know, like they were supremacists is what they were, religious supremacists. And they said, don't you know who's touching you? You know, she's a prostitute. And he said, she loves much because she has been forgiven much. And then he said, daughter, go and sin no more. And I think that there's something very powerful in that story, because I actually heard a pastor say a long time ago, we think that people who have these kind of extreme testimonies are impressive or lucky, you know, or whatever. I had a really unhealthy infatuation as a younger kid who had never gotten into any trouble with people who had stories kind of like the one I'm telling you right now. And this pastor said, we've all been forgiven much. You don't have to go out and do all the worst things in order to be forgiven much. We've all been forgiven much. If we can focus more on the fact that we've been forgiven much already, we will love much. Mm-hmm. And so what a beautiful thing when Jesus said to this woman who was an outcast, you know, to the religious supremacists, your sins have been forgiven, go and sin no more. What a powerful thing. He didn't tell her that like to put pressure on her to be perfect for the rest of her life. I mean, don't you know that anytime you or I got saved, it wasn't like God expected us to go from being who we were the moment before to like the standard of Jesus the moment after, because transformation is a progressive thing. You know, it doesn't happen instantaneously. And I think that Jesus said, go and sin no more to her. And he said this often to people who came to him for one thing or another, to say like, that's not your identity anymore. You have permission to be who I say you are and who I see you as. You don't have to live under your old identity anymore. That's a gift. And I think that being able to move into who God sees me as, apart from how people see me, is what empowers my life to change. So then I don't have to stay trapped in my addiction anymore. True freedom is not that I can't do this anymore. It's that I don't have to do it anymore.
That's good. All right, couple things.
Yeah.
This rock bottom moment you had, the morning you wake up and you realize something's very bad has happened at the hands of these two guys. And you were talking about like going back to this parental equation that your children aren't something you can fix, or their problems necessarily aren't something you can fix. So I wanted to just kind of isolate this. Do you feel like if somebody has a child out there that's struggling with some sort of addiction, because, you know, addiction is like we were talking about before we hit record, it's a wide array of things. It's not just substances. It can be visual things and eating and all kinds of things. Does the child themselves have to decide? Do they have to hit that moment where they decide to be aware or open to change? I mean, it's not something you can impose on them. Like, you had to have this horrific moment, but then it woke you up to say, well, I'm at least going to be aware. I'm at least aware that something's got to change. I don't know how, but I'm aware. So do you feel like that's something that a parent has to understand? They have to maybe allow their child to experience?
I think it depends on how old your child is. You know, I think, gosh, and I hate saying this even now because, one of my incredible, super intellectual children loves video games. And I love them for him in moderation, like in a healthy amount. But certain types of video games are not good for children's brains anyways. You know, psychologists, there's been a lot of research poured into that. And then even beyond that, just screens in general. If you look at the amount of screen time, screens are not even good for us adults. Like, even if it's just staring at the spreadsheet all day, it's just not great for us, you know? And so I think that as a parent, like in this season of life, I actually have to look at, how am I creating an addiction for my child sometimes, you know? And I'm responsible because the way I look at it is my house, my rules. When you pay your own bills, you make the rules, but right now you're living under my roof, you know? And I'm not one of those, you know, like people who like beats their chest and domineers others. Hopefully I try not to be. But like in kindness, like, because I love you, I don't think it's good for you to wake up at 6:15 in the morning and play video games until you go to bed at night. I think you need to come out and interact with the real living, breathing people sometimes, because kids who are totally like controlled by screens, or it can be food or anything else, what happens is they lose the ability to relate to people well. Like, they relate through the lens of their addiction. And because I want my children to have healthy relationships, then like as a parent, because I love them, I don't want to set them up for a failed marriage. I don't want to set them up for, you know, a heart attack because I am giving them endless sugar with no restraint whatsoever. But a child can't be expected to come to a point where he says, oh, the sugar's not good for me, I'm not going to eat so much anymore. Like, they can't moderate that. But as they get older, the older they get, the more we have to step back and remove the controls and let them gradually make more and more decisions for themselves. And we have to allow them to experience the consequences of their own decisions sometimes. And so that's where we get to kind of the question that you originally asked in light of where I was in life when I was interacting with my parents on this. You know, I was a young adult. If your child is not living in your home, like, you're not going to be, I mean, you can try to control them, but that's only going to put a wedge between you. Like, they're just going to push you away. I think that vulnerability, you know, in our relationships is really important. It's easy for me to become angry when people do what I don't want them to do, particularly if it affects me. And I can tell you right now that your child doing anything that you think is dangerous affects you deeply. I mean, just the anxiety alone that it creates. But the reality is being able to be vulnerable. And it's not about, you know, you're such a worthless, lazy, you know, you know, it is like, I love you. Like, you were created for so much more than this. Like, you have so many gifts. I wish you could see what you have to offer this world and that you would pursue that and walk in that. But I love you even now, even while you're not. And I'm going to be praying that someday, somewhere, somehow, God gives you the eyes to see who you are and who he made you to be, as a gift to this world. I think that it really goes back to, in our relationships, that there's a really big difference between inviting somebody to relationship and demanding. The obligation of relationship, like demand, causes us to want to pull away from people, right? Like we don't like to be controlled. And on the other hand, if we invite somebody like in vulnerability and tenderness and kindness, there is this like, oh, I'm wanted, it inspires us to do great things, right? When we are invited to goodness, but when it's demanded of us, it feels like slavery. We are going to push that away as much as we can.
Well, that's the one thing I had in my notes here. You touched on this often. We try to cope and deal with things ourselves, things that we weren't ever meant to deal with or fix. We have to surrender to this higher power. And then you talked about people not understanding when you say, like, I heard the voice of God and I heard this, supreme being talking to me. They're like, oh, she's cuckoo.
Yeah.
But I heard it explained this way in a recent sermon, that we're saved by the word, but we're healed by his people. So, and you have talked, referenced quite often in this podcast about scripture, but it was ultimately an invitation by one of his children to this event that caused this. And I think people had this expectation, well, Lindsey woke up that morning and saw light, or, there was just some, this visual miracle, but it was really through, the consequences of your actions became more difficult to deal with than actually the effort to fix it, right?
Oh yeah, that's it. That's kind of a famous counseling quote is, when the pain to stay the same becomes, exceeds the pain to change, then you'll change, and that's it.
But you became aware that something needed to change, and you became more open to maybe accepting this invitation into this, into relationship, or a renewed relationship with this person who was your roommate. So just being aware of your like inner voice or wisdom that is not of your own, and then being open to, the power of relationship and where that can lead. God, I think just people had this expectation he's going to come down from heaven, extend his hand and drag you, but it's by people. Yeah. It's by community that this happens. People who are in community with him.
Yeah, I think that for me, for so many years, I think that I was mostly, as a younger person, I wasn't really even aware of the thing that happened when I was 3 until later, and I started having these recurring dreams. They were really strange. I asked my parents, and they were like, oh my gosh, we can't believe you remember that. We didn't know exactly what happened. We knew something happened, but we didn't know what happened. But so I'm sure that the 3-year-old incident did affect me. I'm not saying that it didn't, but the 15-year-old incident really affected me. For me, it was kind of when all hell broke loose in my life. So I think that was where the lie entered. Satan uses trauma to plant the seed of a lie in our life. And, if our heart is like a garden, we have to tend to the weeds that are growing there. I didn't tend to that weed. That lie told me that I was unlovable and unworthy. And so because I felt unlovable and unworthy, I slowly but surely kind of distanced myself from people at church because I just felt like I wasn't good enough to be there, felt unworthy. How ironic that all those years later, as I'm returning, the prodigal coming home, that the way that God heals my heart and yanks that weed out of the ground by the root, not just cutting it off at the ground where it can grow back, but fully removes it, is that people in the church who I felt like would judge me, they reached out to me and they loved me, and supported me and rallied around me. Even though at that point, I probably looked far more unlovable than I did in the beginning,
right.
And it was through them that I came to realize that I wasn't unlovable and that I wasn't unworthy. or at least not any more unlovable or unworthy than any of us are, because God loves to take ashes and make beauty out of them. So it all came full circle.
Ooh, I think that's a powerful point, that people can relate whatever pain or trauma they're into is to this crumbling or this pile of ashes, but it can be resurrected into something beautiful. Well, this has been really, really good. I really appreciate you being so vulnerable and so open. I really feel like that's the new leadership. I'm 44. I know it's not right to ask women their age. Are we close to the same age?
I'm 37. And in ways, I still feel like a kid. Like if I hang out, I remember a couple of years ago, my husband and I started doing stuff with the youth at our church, and I just kind of feel like one of them. And so I would like hang out with them, and then nobody would talk to me, and I would be like, am I that uncool? Come on, guys, I'm cool. Like I'm one of you. And then over time, I realized I am so not one of them. Like, I mean, I'm old, but I think that also wisdom is always hard earned. So in ways, I feel a lot older than I am. Trauma taxes our bodies, our minds. And, yet I believe healing is possible. And yet we're always going to be marked by it. I think about how Jacob in the Bible, that he wrestled with God, and that when he left that exchange, that God had like touched his hip, and it says that he always walked with a limp after that, I think that in this process of wrestling with God, that we will wind up probably walking with some kind of a proverbial limp, but it's not a sign of weakness. Like it's a sign that we've wrestled with God and held on for dear life.
Not a crutch either. It's not something to lean on as a crutch. But I was going to say, I was raised to like, whatever you go through that you're not proud of, or no matter what it is, whether you're the victim of something or you victimize somebody else, that's hush hush. Like that's family business. We don't air that. And it's just funny how that has just come full circle to be the absolute wrong thing to do. To be vulnerable is
we build a prison around ourselves that way.
Yeah. And there's whole families that have imprisoned themselves. This history of just imprisonment. So we're in my real estate office. The agents are finally, agents show up late to work, but it's finally starting to kind of heat up around the office. So we need to go. But any parting thoughts before we sign off? Any like wisdom or advice you would leave us with?
Just that there's always hope. There's always hope. And that, God gives strength to the weary. We find ourselves in battles sometimes. And we think, I'm just out of fight, God. Like it's over. I give up. And I think that it's when we come to the end of our own strength that his perfect strength kicks in. Oh, wow. And it's like, well, if I had given up sooner, then his strength would have kicked in sooner and this wouldn't have dragged on for so long. So I think to anybody out there who's going through something hard, regardless of what it is, because there's not a person in this world who's immune to struggle. And so this is for everyone. And that is simply, if you're walking through a struggle, go ahead and admit that his perfect strength is better than your very limited strength, because you can go ahead and get on to the good stuff. You can get on to the healing. You can get on to the beauty that you long for if you stop trying to do it on your own.
Surrender early and often. Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to the Impact Agent Podcast. If you liked the show and got something out of it, please like the Impact Agent Podcast on Facebook and rate and review the show on iTunes or anywhere you listen to podcasts. This really helps us grow the show and helps other agents find it. Please share it with your friends and coworkers as well. Want us to deliver the show to you via email every week? Then email me at jason@impactagentuniversity.com and we'll send you the show every week. Please let us know what you think about the show, what you like, what you don't, or possibly make a suggestion about a topic you want to hear. Email me at jason@impactagentuniversity.com or leave us a message on Facebook at Impact Agent Podcast. Until next week, everybody be productive, safe, and happy, and always keep learning. This podcast is produced by Johnny Gwynn at Deep Fried Studios in Mobile, Alabama, and is paid for and powered by ImpactAgentUniversity.com.